The old hospital stood silent in the darkness. Moonlight painted long, eerie shadows across the empty parking lot. Mark, the night custodian, shivered as he stepped out of his car. A cold wind whispered through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. He hurried inside, eager to escape the unsettling night. Mark's footsteps echoed in the long, sterile corridors. The air hung heavy with the smell of disinfectant and something else he couldn't quite place. A musty, ancient odor. He started his usual routine. The hum of the cleaning cart, a familiar comfort in the stillness. Each squeak of his sneakers on the linoleum floor seemed amplified in the silence. He started with the East Wing, the oldest part of the hospital. It was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and darkened rooms untouched by time. The shadows seemed to deepen as he moved down the hall, stretching out like grasping claws. The hair on the back of his neck prickled with a sudden unease. Mark shook off the feeling and continued his work, his mind wandering to his plans for the weekend. He thought about his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children waiting for him at home. The thought of them brought a smile to his face, a flicker of warmth in the cold, sterile environment. As Mark moved down the hallway, he thought he heard a soft whisper. He paused, holding his breath, listening intently. The sound came again, a low, mournful sigh that seemed to drift from the very walls themselves. His heart pounded in his chest. He strained to identify the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cold draft brushed past him, raising goosebumps on his arms. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. Mark felt a shiver travel down his spine. He quickened his pace, pushing his cleaning cart ahead of him. His thoughts raced as he tried to rationalize the strange whisper. He told himself it was just the old building settling, the wind playing tricks on him. But deep down, a primal fear began to stir. He reached the end of the hallway and flicked on the light switch, but the fluorescent bulbs only flickered weakly, casting the corridor in an unsettling, uneven glow. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe in the dim light. Mark swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. As Mark continued his rounds, the strange occurrences continued. He heard soft, unintelligible whispers at the edge of his hearing. Shadows seemed to move in the periphery of his vision, darting quickly out of sight when he turned to face them. Once, he could have sworn he saw a fleeting figure at the end of a hallway. A tall, gaunt shape that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic rhythm in the silence. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He reached the old maternity ward, its door slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine as he cautiously pushed it open. The room was empty, filled with rows of dusty bassinets, but the air felt heavy, as though someone had just been there. He could almost hear the phantom cries of babies echoing in the silence. Mark hurried out of the room, pulling the door closed behind him. He wanted nothing more than to flee the hospital, to escape the oppressive atmosphere and the strange, unsettling events. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination that warred with his growing fear. Section 4. The photograph. He found himself drawn to a room at the end of the hall, a room he'd never entered before. It was an old storage room, its door hanging slightly ajar. He peered inside, his curiosity overcoming his apprehension. The room was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight from the window. Dust motes danced in the pale light, revealing stacks of old medical equipment and forgotten files. In the center of the room stood a solitary desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. Something glinted in the moonlight, drawing Mark's eye. He approached cautiously and reached out, his fingers brushing against a cold, glass surface. It was a picture frame, its silver tarnished with age. He picked it up, wiping away the dust with his sleeve. The photograph showed a young nurse, her eyes wide and fearful, standing beside a tall, shadowy figure. The figure was indistinct, its features lost in the darkness, but Mark could sense a palpable aura of menace emanating from it. He stared at the photograph, a chill spreading through him. The whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around him like a cold wind. Section 5. A ghostly revelation. As Mark stared at the photograph, the room seemed to grow colder. The shadows around him deepened, taking on the shape of the figure in the picture. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, sending goosebumps erupting across his skin. He spun around, dropping the photograph with a clatter, his heart hammering in his chest. Standing before him, partially obscured by the shadows, was the figure from the photograph. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a swirling mist. Mark gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The figure raised a hand, its form shimmering as though it were made of smoke. Mark could feel an icy cold emanating from it, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen in terror. Then, with a voice that seemed to whisper from the grave itself, the figure spoke. It spoke of a tragedy, of a life unjustly taken, of a restless spirit seeking justice. Mark listened, his blood turning to ice as the ghost recounted its tale of betrayal and murder. Section 6. A warning from beyond. The ghostly figure explained that it had been a doctor at the hospital, murdered in this very room a century ago. The murderer had been a colleague driven by jealousy and greed. The doctor's spirit had been trapped ever since, unable to find peace. The ghost then turned its sorrowful eyes on Mark, its voice a low, mournful whisper. It spoke of a danger lurking within the hospital walls, a malevolent force that threatened anyone who dared to enter. It warned Mark to leave, to alert the authorities, to never return. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the ghostly figure faded away, leaving Mark alone in the darkness. The room was silent once more, the only sound the beating of his own heart. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with fear. Mark fled the hospital, the ghost's warning echoing in his ears. He never returned, the memory of that night forever seared into his mind. And as he lay in bed at night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of his vision. He knew then that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the darkness.